Reynolds. I'm a Vice President of Operations here at Export Solutions. I'd like to officially welcome everybody to today's session, which we call the best webinar you will ever attend about export control. One of the reasons we think it's the best webinar is because it's free, and we hope that you all agree with us at least on that piece of it. But we really have designed this over the years. It's our longest running webinar that we've held, and the purpose of it is to introduce a lot of people who don't have any real deep knowledge or background about ITAR and EAR compliance to the regulations. So this is an introductory course. We're going to cover very basic topics for a lot of you. It may be too basic. We will get into some more advanced topics as we go through, but if the questions and the dialogue start to get too detailed or too much down in the weeds, we may defer those questions for later, because the general scope of this and the general purpose is to be an introductory course for the participants. I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Hopefully you're all having a good day today. I know in Florida where I am, we've got the dog days of August going on, so it's incredibly hot. And we're looking forward to it cooling down here soon. But I hope everybody's having a good day on Wednesday today. Just a couple of housekeeping things that I wanted to talk about before I introduce today's presenter and turn it over. One of the questions that we often get about this session is when will we get a copy of the slides, or can we receive a copy of the slides, and can we access this later? I'll just tell you that we do offer these slides to all of the participants. They're to be used as a resource for your company. They're not to be sold to or transferred to other parties. But we will typically post those on our website within a week of today's session. So by next Wednesday, if you go to our website, exportsolutionsinc.com, you should be able to download a copy of the slides and also view a recording of this session. We are recording this session in the audio and video format. And so if you have somebody on your team who missed it or you want to revisit it, you can always go back to our website again within a week, and generally we'll be able to view this session. We do offer a series of free webinars throughout the year. I think we have 6 on the docket for this year, and this is our 5th one. So we have one more that's coming up in October, and that one is around shipping documentation. So we're going to cover all the topics around making sure that your commercial invoice is prepared correctly, AES filings, getting your shipment documentation prepared for export in a correct way. If that's of interest to you, that next session is going to be on October 8th, and you can sign up for free on our website, which is exportsolutionsinc.com. So feel free to go there and check that out, and we hope to have you join us at a future session. At this point, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. His name is Ray Castanero, and I'll give you a little bit of background about Ray. Ray is one of our senior consultants for trade compliance. He has more than 28 years of experience in trade compliance across a variety of roles, including empowered official. Ray is a certified professional contracts manager. He's been a program manager and a U.S. government contracting policy officer for a variety of different companies. Ray's extensive career is focused on helping companies meet the regulatory requirements and achieve their business objectives under ITAR, EAR, OFAC, NAFTA, and ATF regulations. Ray is also a subject matter expert in the FAR and DFAR supplements, as well as other related regulations. And he has an in-depth understanding of the regulatory changes in conjunction with policies and programs. So Ray joins us today from North Richland Hills, Texas, where he lives. And I'd like to welcome Ray onto the call. Are you there, Ray?
I'm here, Tom. Thank you very much.
Great.
One thing I'm not expert at is flipping slides, as you can see, but I accidentally hit the end button before, and it took us to the thank you. But anyway,
no problem.
That being what it is, welcome everybody. And my name is Ray. If you need to address me at any time in this, that's fine. First thing is, why is export control such a big issue? Well, the regulations have been around for more than 30 years. To people who are not familiar with them, sometimes that comes as a shocker. The International Traffic in Arms Regulation became law in 1976, and why is there suddenly an interest? Well, obviously some of the reasons are after 9/11, the whole world changed, and we wound up with enemies we didn't know we had, and friends who became more important than they were at the time. But basically, these controls have been in place, and there's been more emphasis on them since 9/11. The government, of course, takes this very, very seriously, and they have levied fines and penalties, and we'll look at a couple of examples of those later on in this presentation. And of course, if you're not a prime contractor, or if you're doing work with original equipment manufacturers, you're going to find out there are going to be flow-down clauses that require you to be in compliance with the export control laws and regulations. So these are three big reasons why this is a lot of emphasis. Okay, why has it become such a big issue? We already talked about what are your risks. We're going to talk about what are the basics you need to get started with an export compliance program, and how your company would benefit by addressing this issue, and then what your next steps would be, etc. Okay. Essentially, if you're, and as Tom said, this may be a little more basic for some people who have some experience with export compliance, but we're assuming that the person who is here for the first time and thinking about this for the first time is basically where it shows on the slide. You're at the beginning of the timeline. That's no knowledge, no system, no compliance, possible violations. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb for the whole world is you don't know what you don't know, and hopefully this webinar will raise your awareness to at least sometimes you may be able to figure out what you don't know, or at least some idea of it. And of course, at this stage of the game, your risk of violations is huge. It goes from not having any knowledge, and then the finite point on the far right, could be a violation. There could be a lot of problems for you. We're going to talk about those. Okay, so where is your company? Okay, some understanding. For some people who have a little bit more understanding, they've got a partial system in place. Sometimes they inherited it from a previous owner. Let's say your company was owned by another company, and there's been a different merger or something now. Some people had an expert sometime in the not too distant past, and they're using the compliance system that person or that department might have set up, and there may not be a full understanding of it. Of course, you got some basic compliance going on. A lot of people do things by rote memory. They know, well, I need a license, and I'll get a license. But there could be potential violations because there's a lot more involved in this than just getting licenses. And of course, if you're in the middle, kind of the way most companies or many companies are, you did your due diligence up front, and then your risk, the little risk bubble, the football-shaped thing, is a bit smaller if you've done some due diligence. Now, if you're way out here on the slide, you've got full understanding. You've implemented a system, you're in compliance, your violations are minimized, you may have done some disclosures already to the government, and essentially your awareness has been raised, and that's been all the due diligence. Please note that the risk bubble on the far right theoretically never completely goes away. What you're doing, in fact, what a fully compliant system does, it minimizes the risk and it mitigates the impact of the risk. That's really what you're trying to do, because being human beings, nobody is perfect, and we're not striving for perfection here. We're striving for a system that will keep your risk as minimal as it can be, that you have enough understanding that you can mitigate that risk, and that you know enough to disclose to the government to keep yourself out of real trouble. And that's essentially what the goal is here. Okay, obviously a foolproof system is not practical. People do make mistakes. We already said that. Your system will catch those mistakes, prompt and accurate disclosures for the government. When you self-disclose, generally speaking, that's how you avoid penalties and other pretty bad things happening to your company. As long as it remains voluntary and you remain cooperative with the government in those situations, they prefer to work with you, so that when both parties walk away from the disclosure, the government is relatively certain that you're not going to at least make that same mistake again. As a result, of course, your potential fines and penalties will be greatly reduced or non-existent, depending on how the government sees your cooperation. Due diligence, as with everything in business, is the key to keep yourself out of trouble. Now, here's a couple of enforcement actions. I just updated this slide recently to add 2013. The China nuclear industry, I guess that's pronounced Waxing construction company, is actually owned by the Chinese government, and they were fined $3 million for violations. The main British Aerospace BAE in the UK, as a result of some violations in 2013, were denied export privileges plus a $400 million fine for conspiracy, false statements, and bribery. So it can get pretty bad, especially if you've seen this to not be cooperating. Airflex, $8 million in a civil penalty. Raytheon, big companies like Raytheon and General Dynamics in the past, et cetera, Boeing, because they're so huge, you'll find their names on these lists quite a bit. $8 million for hundreds of, that's in quotes, that was actually from the court decision. Hundreds of U.S. export law violations. I believe they pled to that one, but $8 million, I don't know about you, but I could not absorb an $8 million loss myself. And then you see it goes back to United Technologies, and some of them, $20,000 down there where it says TS Trade Tech Incorporated. $20,000, that can put a hurting on you. It's not $3 million, it's not $400 million. But then you look back in 2011, there's BAE Systems again, $79 million for ITAR violations. So you can see that nobody is perfect, and the more you're involved in government and defense type business, the more at risk you are, and probably the more you should know. So that's just an example.
Ray, this is Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ray, just one thing that I wanted to comment about this slide, and one of the reasons I like this slide is because a lot of things that I hear from people are, a rumor or a false belief is that only big companies get in trouble, and that's certainly not the case. I mean, there are companies here that we've all heard of and know about, but there are a lot of other companies just on this slide and who have gotten in trouble in the past that no one's ever heard of before. And so just that myth out there that only the big guys are the ones who are getting in trouble for these regulations, I think is one that needs to be debunked, because you can be the smallest mom and pop type shop out there and still run afoul of the government if you don't pay attention to these regulations.
Yeah, point well taken. And also, the violations, obviously, the smaller the company, the bigger the violation hurts them, if you will. So, but that is a point well taken. No, they don't just, anybody can commit a violation and can be fined and get into quite a bit of trouble with the government. Okay, here's a quick case study. We're not going to read through all the words on the slides, but Key Optic, I don't know if you've heard of the company. They're incorporated in Luxembourg. They had 163 violations of the ITAR, and they started as a voluntary disclosure. And as you can see, the statement there, essentially because it was voluntary. And it was the violations were committed prior to their acquisition of the business units that committed the violations, et cetera. There were mitigating circumstances. They could have charged the Key Optic in this case with additional violations, could have pursued more severe penalties. So you can see that if you voluntarily disclose and you cooperate fully with the government, they're always going to let you know that we could have slapped your wrist a lot harder or we could have hurt you a lot harder. So it always pays to cooperate. And this is some of the background. Key Optic purchased a number of companies from Thales from their optics group. And one day before the purchase, Thales decided to file a voluntary disclosure with the State Department. The timing of that you can probably debate offline, but it was the day before the purchase. And then there were, among other things, unauthorized exports to France, Israel, Singapore, and China. And China is a big no-no. But generally speaking, this even to NATO-friendly allied countries like France and allies like Israel, countries like Singapore, very, very business-oriented, still require some kind of controls for exporting. And they use third-country nationals working for them without technical assistance agreements. And these were what we'll go into a little bit more what deemed re-exports are, but these are not, we're actually sending something overseas. This is giving someone technical knowledge. So it's basically, from you to this person who is not a U.S. person. And there's supposed to be some kind of controls over it, in this case, a technical assistance agreement. They violated that. They were, I guess, in compliance with their own Singapore Strategic Goods Act and not the ITAR. They probably thought that was good enough. And remember, each country has its own controls, and one does not trump the others. Because you comply with one, it doesn't mean that you're in compliance with the other. So you have to be very, very aware that countries have the rights to control their strategic goods, but every country involved, at least you have to consider it and be in compliance with those laws. And you can see there were other unauthorized exports. There were Russia, Cyprus, Germany, Hungary, Iran. So this was a fairly large case. And essentially, you see this an awful lot. ITT got a huge, violation about a little more than a decade ago, 110 million at the time. It was the record. It's no longer the record. But you'll always see this, that essentially if you don't have a proper export compliance system, that in and of itself exacerbates the situation, because then you have a systemic problem. You don't have a one-off violation. And you can see that the highlighted part, or the bold face, is that they were deemed to have a long-standing lack of support for ITAR compliance. So the government takes it very, very seriously, almost personally, you might say. But that's not having a system in place is not going to help you at all. That's really going to hurt you. And then you can see the last bullet here. They actually had a 2003 training presentation where they told their employees to avoid making disclosures due to the risk of discovery by U.S. companies or authorities. So they were actually turning a blind eye to the problems and training their employees to do the same. And you can see here, their quote is, they're basically saying, if you get an advisory opinion or something from the U.S. government, the person's going to play by the book. They're going to be strict. It's going to be costly. So therefore, it would be a bad thing to disclose, and that's what they're saying. Basically, they're telling you, if you hired somebody like us, or if you had somebody from the U.S. government come and audit you or look at you, that they're going to push you to clean up everything. And well, of course they would, because it would be unethical to tell you to cover up everything in the past. So basically, they were accused of and found guilty of self-blinding and willful violations. Now, when you see the word willful, that's when you start getting into the holding people personally responsible to work for the company, officers of the company. That's when people get jail time, not just a simple, the company pays a violation, fixes the export system, and moves on. So willful violations and turning a blind eye to this is about the worst you can do. And here's what they agreed to: Thales and Keyoptic, $25 million in fines, and then remedial compliance measures. They needed a special internal compliance officer to oversee all their export compliance. They had to do yearly reports that other people do not have to do, outlining all of their compliance costs. Now, there's a key right there, because I remember in the ITT case that I mentioned earlier, one of the exacerbating circumstances was they said that, well, you have $4 billion worth of programs, and if you add up the entire cost of your export compliance system, it comes out to like $100,000 a year or something. It was like, I think it was one person's salary and some administrative costs, which the government's going to look at that and just say, $4 billion in business, $100,000 being spent for export compliance. You're obviously not taking it seriously. So they will do a cost comparison survey to see that you're spending the proper amount of money and applying the proper amount of resources to export compliance. They got direct oversight, and that's what we call a consent agreement. And some of the worst consent agreements, or the most potent, if you will, I've seen was they'll actually send in a government overseer, and you'll have to give that person an office, a phone, access to fax machines, et cetera. And essentially, if you're in a consent agreement where you have an on-site government representative, that person's going to crash every meeting you have or require you to invite them to every meeting. So you really don't want that if you can avoid it. And of course, legal department oversight. This general counsels are not big fans of that. And they also had on-site reviews of compliance efforts by State Department officials. So basically, they were being audited. They were in a state of constant vigilance and constant oversight as a result of this. So the $25 million in fines is, that's bad enough. But when you add everything else up, they really got smacked pretty hard for this. And another reason why you don't want this to happen to you is And this is just a screenshot, taken on a given day or whatever. But these violations are public record. You can see that the year-wise, they go back prior to 1978, where it says undated. That's right there. And then, of course, you can click on any of these links when you go online, and you can read the actual case and the violations and everything. And whenever I've given this type of training to people before, they will sometimes actually look in here and say, oh, my goodness, that's one of our suppliers or something. So, or one of my clients or one of my customers. So you really don't want your name up in lights like this. And then here's another place under the Department of Commerce where these things are listed. And this is essentially shows you the enforcement division and how it's constructed. But when you look at the major cases list, you can click on that. Don't let this happen to you. And you really don't want to be the person at conferences like SIA and some of these annual conferences in Washington where your company gets to be the featured speaker because you're the latest and greatest of the violations. You really want to avoid that. Here are some of the maximum penalties. This is again to raise your awareness. If it makes you a little scared, that's entirely up to you. But under the Export Administration regulations, under the Department of Commerce, civil penalties can be the greater of $250,000 or twice the value of the transactions. So that can add up pretty quickly. And notice it's not the lesser of the two; it's the greater of the two. Up to $1 million criminal violations and/or 20 years imprisonment. To me, that's about the worst thing you could do to somebody. Put them in prison, I guess. Under the International Traffic and Arms regulations, which is controlled by the State Department, civil fines up to $500,000 per violation. And that's a key there, because if you had, let's say, 100 licenses that went out and were used improperly, or you overused the license, you went past its value, et cetera, each one of these things is one violation. It could be $500,000 per violation. So this can really add up. Criminal fines up to $1 million per violation and/or 10 years imprisonment. Once again, this is all per violation. So as you can see, most people plead to something lesser on this, and you don't want to be caught into this. You don't want to be put into this situation. Okay, your reputation obviously is going to suffer. For the patriotic person within you, it does threaten U.S. national security. That's a huge part of why these controls are in place. It could wreck your business. As I said, I don't know how many companies can absorb fines of that magnitude, but even if you're a small company, a $20,000 fine could be ruinous to you. A lot of companies work in very small margins. Ruins your reputation. You may drive some of your customers to your competitors because you have a bad reputation and they don't want to, get into trouble with you. And then, your customer is going to lose confidence in you for sure. So these are some of the, if you will, unintended consequences of doing the wrong thing. Now, does anybody have questions so far? Tom, do you want to explain to them how do you want to handle the questions, or?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. I did forget to mention this at the beginning of the call, but we are interested in having dialogue and questions with all of you. To facilitate that and make it the easiest process, we're going to keep everybody muted during the call. We found in these webinars that trying to unmute people and have actual dialogue is just sometimes cumbersome. So the way we would like to handle questions, and we'll be pausing at various points throughout the presentation, if you can just type those questions in to the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. I'll be monitoring that box, and as we get questions coming in, we'll pause and I will voice those questions, and then if there's further dialogue or follow-up that's required, just let us know and we can revisit the topic. So we do have a few questions now at this point. First one, Ray, for you is how does the government prove a willful violation versus an honest mistake?
Well, when you if you looked at the Key-Optic Talus case study that we did, the government during their audit, during their investigation, actually found out that they were training their employees to say, hey, look the other way on certain violations. So right off the bat, you could shoot yourself in the foot. That's the most obvious one, that you put it in writing that you're essentially not going to obey the law. Other ways they may see willful, where they say something is willful as opposed to an honest mistake, is if they see a pattern. Remember, they're going to come in the case of a violation, and they're going to interview employees, and they're going to do it behind closed doors without a management representative there in many cases. There's a lot of company policies, and general counsels may prohibit this. But the bottom line of it is, they're going to talk to employees. They're going to talk to ex-employees who might be disgruntled. And believe me, if you're willfully turning a blind eye, they will route it out. Again, an honest mistake usually becomes pretty obvious that it's an honest mistake, and when something's willful, it becomes pretty obvious that it's willful.
Great, thank you. Another question. I don't know if you know this or not, Ray. We might need to jump back on the slides, but the question is, was Keyoptic a U.S.-owned company based overseas? I think it was a Luxembourg-based company.
That's correct. Yeah, the first slide on it said that, right, it was a Luxembourg LLC at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I
they
think
were not incorporated. Yeah, they were not incorporated in the U.S. at the time. They do have divisions now that are, but at the time, no.
Right. I would interpret the gist of that question to mean how can they get in trouble with U.S. laws because they're a foreign company. So maybe you want to speak to that a little.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, if you're doing business with the United States or the U.S. government or American companies, you are subject to the ITAR. There are some countries that don't recognize what they call the extraterritoriality of the United States law, but the United States does. I suppose if we weren't such a big customer or client to the whole world, it would be harder to enforce these things. But as it is, countries like England and Canada and France and all of the big countries that you would imagine would be reluctantly have to accept U.S. law in these cases, because if you're going to do business with the United States, one of the biggest tools that the government has, the State Department and the Commerce Department, is they can debar you from doing business with the United States. They can debar you from exporting, and it really can be ruinous. So, yes, the U.S. can impose its will on other countries, and they do.
Great, thank you. I have other questions about what does ITAR mean, and can you define an export, and some of those kinds of questions that are coming through. And I'm just going to table those for now because I do know that the presentation is going to cover those topics as we get further in. So I'll let Ray continue, and then if those folks who have asked those questions, if we still want to come back and revisit that, just let us know. But for anybody, just a reminder again that you can communicate with us via the chat or the Q&A toolbar, and we would like to hear your questions as we go through. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. Okay, here are some of the basics, and as luck would have it, the first bullet is, what is an export? What is the ITAR? What is the EAR? What is OFAC? Don't worry, this alphabet soup will become clear to you. It'll be defined for you. And an important basic is product classification. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, basically an export is anything sent from the United States to a foreign destination, to include a company or person even within the United States. That's an export. All items and articles leaving the U.S. are exports and therefore may be subject to controls and restrictions. Obviously, not everything requires a license, but the consideration is you have to consider what the controls. The controls may very well be no license required, but it has to be addressed. Items can include hardware, information in any way, shape, or form. Back when people were first starting to use CD-ROMs and other forms of media, some companies got into trouble because since the government didn't specify that sending a CD someplace with information on it was an export, there are no loopholes in this. If someone comes up with a new, something to replace the flash drive, it's all inclusive. There are no loopholes for this. There's no way that you can couch information and say, well, technically this is not an export. It is. Any way you can export information, even verbally to somebody, is considered an export and may or may not be controlled. Software is controlled. Technology such as composites, the technique of layering composites for strength and certain characteristics, that's all controlled. And of course, manufacturing know-how is a big thing. In addition to the strategic reasons to protect all these things, especially the Commerce Department wants to protect the manufacturing know-how and the economic base of the United States. So it's kind of an all-inclusive set of regulations to protect this country. Okay, more about what is an export. An export can be physical, the traditional, what you think about, putting a part in a box and sending it somewhere by FedEx or mail or something. Oral or verbal, telling somebody information about a controlled part, that's an export. Visual, if somebody sees controlled information, a big thing is, you're giving a tour through your factory or your work area, and you have some ITAR controlled parts, and there are drawings, detailed drawings that your shop personnel use to build this part or to measure it or to inspect it, and a foreign person comes over and looks at the drawing, that's also an export. Someone looking over your shoulder on an airplane, and they can see the screen on your laptop, and you're doing a little work on behalf of your company. If that person sitting next to you is a foreign person, and let's face it, you might not know, that would be an export as well. So you really want to be careful what you carry overseas, what you do in public, etc. Okay, who and what you need to think about, even if you don't send hardware out of the country. That's a big question right there. A lot of people say, well, we don't export anything, but as you can see, there are many ways to export. And here are some of the exports that can happen without really you realizing. You may have some non-U.S. employees. You may have customers you haven't properly screened, and you may find out the hard way that they're on a denied parties list. Email, email bounces off servers all over the world before it gets to its destination. So if you're going to send control data by email, you need to have some kind of controls in place to make that happen. Telephone conversations, just putting something in an envelope, putting a stamp on it, and mailing it someplace. As I said, there are no loopholes in this. Information can be conveyed any way that you can convey information, no matter how creative you get with it. Visitors and potential customers may be on the denied parties list. Once again, screen everybody, screen early, screen often. People who appear on these denied parties lists aren't born on them. So at some point in their lives, they go from being just a regular person to being a denied party. And, if you were doing business with them and you hadn't checked in a long time, you may find yourself in trouble for dealing with a denied party. You may put information on your company's website, which the whole world can see, and you didn't screen it, you didn't consider export controls with it. So that's a way of actually exporting something and getting into trouble for doing it properly. If you make downloadable information available to people, that kind of goes with the website idea. But as I said, there are no loopholes. Any way you can convey information could be an export if it goes from the U.S. to somebody else. Data on your computers, networks, and hard drives, etc. There are controls that we have in systems, and vigilant companies have, where they literally will, if someone's going to travel overseas, they won't take their normal company laptop. IT will give them a scrubbed laptop that only has what they need on it, so that information, if the laptop were to get stolen or compromised in some way, you want to be able to still protect your information. So a comprehensive export compliance program will consider all of these things and address them. Okay, it's not an export if you go U.S. person to U.S. person. Is obviously not. If Tom and I are in a room and we're exchanging, we work together and we're exchanging technical data, that may be controlled or something. It's not an export because we're both U.S. persons working for a U.S. company in this case. So that's the exception would be if the U.S. person receiving is employed by a foreign company, then the government considers that their loyalty would be to that foreign company. Therefore, they must be treated as a foreign person, even though they're a U.S. person. But that's the exception there. Okay, and what is a U.S. person? We generally don't use the word citizen broadly, but a citizen certainly is a U.S. person, a U.S. citizen, but also any permanent resident alien, somebody who has a green card, somebody who's been given asylum by the U.S. government. Essentially, anyone who is legally in the United States on a permanent basis, as opposed to being on a visa, is considered a U.S. person for export control purposes. And a foreign person is everybody else. Anyone who's not a U.S. person is a foreign person for export compliance purposes. Once again, if you're working for a foreign company, you need to be treated as a foreign person for export purposes, because that's where your loyalty, your paycheck basically has the foreign company's name on it. And then a foreign destination is any country or company other than the United States. Canada, believe it or not, even though they're attached, is a foreign country. There are certainly special exemptions for Canada. There are some treaty exemptions for the United Kingdom and Australia as well. But generally speaking, those have to be specifically addressed with those companies, and in many cases only with certain programs that are cooperative between the two countries. But for all intents and purposes, if it is not the United States, it is a foreign country, and there will have to be some kind of controls that have to be addressed. Now, this is a classic definition of an export. As I said, putting something in a box and sending it from the USA to Germany. So that would be an export, any foreign country. We use Germany as an example. A re-export we talk about would be you take that initial export from the USA to Germany, and then they export it to Japan. And in business, world economy, that happens every day, where you send your product to Germany, and then Germany adds their part to it, whatever, and then they send it to Japan. So if something is going to be controlled, you could possibly be involved in a violation inadvertently if you didn't perform your due diligence and know that your items, the end use, was going to be in a third country, which might have required a license or an exemption or something. But that's a re-export when you have a third country involved. A retransfer is you take that initial export that goes to company A in Germany, and then they have to send it to company B in the same country or the same territory, and that's a retransfer. It's within the same country. Once again, if you had a license in place or you had an exemption in place, it might not be a violation, but that is a retransfer. So it goes from the U.S. to a country, and then within that country, it goes to a different entity or end user or a different company. We mentioned deemed export earlier. That's essentially taking an idea or a bit of tech data that's in my brain, because I'm an engineer, and I know something about this ITAR controlled product or EAR controlled product, and then I explain it to a German national. So now that person understands it. That is a deemed export. If you notice, no paper changed places or anything. Could have been by telephone, could have been by fax, could have been by email, and once again, any way you can transmit it. But that is a deemed export, essentially, even if there's no media involved. And a lot of times you've seen these violations that companies committed deemed export violations. A common violation is if you have a weekly conference call with your parent company that's in a foreign country, and you don't check the citizenship or the personhood, if you will, of everyone in the room. So you may very well have a technical assistance agreement with this German company, a subsidiary or an owner company, but they have employees that may be from France or the UK or Lithuania or someplace like that, and you didn't perform your due diligence and know who's on the other end of the phone. That could be considered a deemed export, and it could be a violation. Deemed re-export, we're getting a little bit into the weeds here, but essentially no paper or no physical items have changed places, but you deemed exported it to that German national, and then that person passes it on to a Japanese national in this case. So as you can see, these things can kind of mushroom out, where violations can get pretty complicated. But that would be a deemed re-export. Okay, I'm going to talk about the regulations here. One of the bullets we have is what is the ITAR? The International Traffic in Arms Regulations is what ITAR stands for. The EAR is the Export Administration Regulations, and then I think one of the bullets was what is OFAC. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. We'll talk a little bit about what these folks do. And essentially, which agency is responsible for the ITAR? That would be the Department of State, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC. You may see even in some of their own documentation, it may say ODTC, Office of Defense Trade Controls, same organization. They became a directorate some years ago, and some of their paperwork still refers to ODTC because it's otherwise still accurate. So, but ODTC, DDTC is the same thing. Something is controlled or considered to be an ITAR item if it is on what is called the United States Munitions List on the USML. This is a section of the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and it covers all kinds of anything that's related to defense, space, very, very high technology, etc. Is all on the U.S. munitions list. Now, if an item has dual use or commercial application, it's controlled under the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, and that's controlled and enforced by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and specifically their Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. So that's who owns the Export Administration Regulations, or the EAR. If your product is going to a sanctioned country, you hear about sanctions all the time on the news, and you know that these countries change from time to time, but essentially that is controlled through the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. So whenever you hear OFAC, it is an office underneath the Department of the Treasury. So those are the big three. You've got the DDTC, the BIS, and OFAC. Okay, as we said, the ITAR is administered by the DDTC. Some categories are enumerated and some are broadly defined. It used to be, as a matter of fact, this slide was just recently updated. We used to say the ITAR categories are broadly defined. Specific to ground vehicles, aircraft, and spacecraft, the ITAR has been tightening up its definitions because there was a lot of things were so broad that nobody really understood it. So now what they're doing is they're enumerating things very, very specifically. So there's very little gray area anymore where you know that if something is going to be controlled or not. And of course, all items on the U.S. munitions list are controlled in some way, some more than others, some only to certain countries. Now, we talked about way earlier, if you recall, I said something about classification of a product. Don't think of classified in the way we, in the military or sometimes the defense business talks about something being classified as in secret or top secret or confidential. When we're talking about classification, we are talking about literally classifying where a product, which domain it exists under, and which jurisdiction is over it, whether it's on the U.S. munitions list or if it's under control of the EAR. So then we talk about classification of a product, that's what we need. And here's an example of the U.S. munitions list. It's Part 121 of the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, the ITAR. And the ITAR goes, it's part of a section of Code of Federal Regulations, essentially Parts 120 through 130. Part 121 of that is the U.S. munitions list. And I guess if you look down the columns left and right, Category 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's the first half of them goes down to Category 10. So you may see some of your products that would probably fall under one of these categories. Category 1s will be all your guns and bullets. Category 8 over on the right side, 3 down, is aircraft and associated equipment. And essentially that's the broad categories. And here's the second half of it. Military electronics, fire control, rangefinders, etc. A note is if you look down on the far right, Category 21, miscellaneous articles. If you are self-classifying your products, if you're pretty comfortable that it is some category or another, whatever. Category 21 essentially is for the government to decide, not for you. It's for offhand I really can't think of anything that really fits into Category 21. It's just there as kind of a placeholder. If somebody were to invent some kind of new military technology that can't be defined by any of the other 20 categories, then Category 21 would come into play. But as you can see, Category 19 is reserved. So they even have that one that they can use for something else later in the future. Okay, a lot of questions come up, people, about registering your company with the State Department. If you work on defense items, as described on the U.S. munitions list, or perform any defense services, you have to be required. Yet you're required to register with the State Department. Basically, it's an online process. You pay a fee, and you basically register for a year, and you have to renew it every year. And you also, if there are any substantive changes, such as the ownership of your company, whatever, you're required to report on that and update your registration. It's all covered in Section 122 of the ITAR. It goes right after the U.S. munitions list, but it is required. There is a myth that since you don't manufacture anything, you don't have to register. Well, the fact is, even if you do not export anything, if you're a manufacturer of anything on the U.S. munitions list, if you take part in the process, if you do metal finishing, for instance, on some kind of military ordnance, whatever, you don't actually manufacture it, but you do the finishing on it, you are required to be registered with the State Department. The government wants to know every company that is touching, if you will, U.S. defense items. They want to know who's in the business, and that's why you have to register. And here's the direct side out of the ITAR 122.1, subparagraph A. Any person who engages in the United States in the business of either, emphasis on either, manufacturing or exporting defense articles or furnishing defense services, and we'll define these in a couple of slides, by the way, is required to register with the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. and you must nevertheless register even if you manufacture and don't export. What it does not mean is that you're certified in some way to work on defense articles, or that you are compliant. I mean, you can be registered. In fact, that's usually the first step that people do, and then do nothing else and have no compliance program. It's not the government blessing your company and saying that you're compliant. It just means that you're registered. They know who you are. It's essentially you letting the DDTC know that you work on defense articles or provide defense services. Nothing more than that. And when we talk about defense services, it's defined in 120.9 of the ITAR. And essentially, if you look down to the third bullet, if you're furnishing assistance, including training to any foreign persons, and by the way, anytime we use the word persons in any of this, persons can also be companies. You know, when you're incorporated, it means you created an artificial person that is a company. So whenever you see foreign persons or U.S. persons, it also means companies, U.S. companies and foreign companies. And defense services would be the development, design, engineering, manufacture, production, assembly, test, repair, maintenance, modification, operation, demilitarization, destruction, processing, or use of defense articles. So it's anything that you can use to process these things. Demilitarization is covered because ostensibly, if you know how to demilitarize, let's say, a military helicopter and turn it into a civil helicopter, you could reverse engineer that process and learn how to turn a civilian helicopter into a military item. So that's why demilitarization is covered. If you're furnishing restricted technical data to a foreign person, that could be considered a defense service as well. Okay, we're going to pause for questions here. Tom, if you have any, you can go ahead and fire those at me.
Thanks, Ray. A couple questions. So we have to register with ITAR even if we don't export something, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And you're registering at, it's pretty straightforward. If you're involved in the manufacturing or processing of defense articles, which means items on the U.S. conditions list in the ITAR, you have to be registered. Once again, if you think of it kind of big picture, the U.S. government wants to know who is involved in the defense business in any way, shape, or form. So that's why you need to be registered.
Thanks. Another question here. Does every company have to hire an import-export officer? As with a lot of the answers in this business and in this world of export compliance, it depends. If you are manufacturing items and you are not exporting them and you have controls in place to make sure that they're not exported, theoretically, could you get away without having an export officer? Sure. But the reality of it is, if you're a small mom-and-pop type operation, let's say you have a total of 5 employees, somebody, even if they don't have that title, is going to be acting in that capacity. It's really a matter of, we talked about the due diligence versus the risk. If you want to increase the due diligence and reduce the risk as much as possible, somebody has to be the person who's in charge of export compliance. Now, whether you call that person an ECO or whether you just call it the Vice President of Operations, you know, that's really up to you. Those are business decisions. Those are incorporation decisions. But essentially, do you need to go out and hire somebody specifically? Once again, if you're doing exporting, you should. And remember, I talked about the trade-off of, you know, you have $4 billion worth of contracts, but you're only spending $100,000 a year on export compliance, including the salary of one person. That's probably going to be considered not enough. So you need to think about what you're doing with respect to manufacturing and processing of ITAR items, and then how involved, if at all, you are with the export process. And so you really need to, you know, you need to have some kind of program in place to control these things, and that would usually mean having a person who is, if not an expert in it, somebody who's knowledgeable of it. I hope that addresses the question. I know it's kind of nebulous, but you know, again, it depends on, you know, it depends on how involved you are with the U.S. munitions list. Yep. Thanks, Ray. Okay, another question here. What does dual use mean?
Okay, yeah, I don't know if we have that on another slide, but we can address that really quickly. Dual use items determines what is controlled by the Export Administration regulations as opposed to the ITAR. A dual use item means that it is used by both, let's say, civilians and private persons, et cetera, civil civil people, civil companies, etc., and also can be used by the U.S. military. An example of something that's a dual-use item, might be a laptop. I can use my laptop, working from my home. I can use it to play Angry Birds or something like that. But a soldier in the field in Afghanistan may also have one, and that it may be used for military purposes. Well, if those two laptops are identical and there's nothing specifically military modified on the soldier's laptop, that's a dual-use item, and it would be controlled by the Export Administration regulations. Something that is not a dual-use item would be like an F-15E Strike Eagle. There is no civil application for that aircraft, and it is enumerated on the U.S. munitions list as a controlled aircraft, and all of its parts and things, that go into it may or may not be controlled depending on what they are. So essentially, dual use just means it can be used by either the military or the civilians. There is nothing that is single-use civilian. Even a paperclip can be used by the military as a paperclip in an office. That's why it's called dual use. So there's nothing that's purely civil, although there are things that are purely defense-related.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ray, is that it flows one way and not the other, so that the military can come and use anything, making it dual use, but civilians and commercial companies cannot take something that's ITAR and start using it commercially, and then suddenly it becomes dual use. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work the opposite.
No, it doesn't work the opposite unless you go through a formal process of what we call a commodity jurisdiction, where you formally request the State Department to take this item. Hey, it's been in production for 30 years. It started out as purely military. It now has significant civilian applications, et cetera. But in other words, the formal process you would have to go through where the State Department decides, yea, verily, this is now a dual-use item. You cannot do that yourself.
Right, right. Okay, and then a question on registration, if actually something to confirm. Freight forwarders who arrange for the movement of the cargo only do not require registration with ITAR. Can you? Is that a statement or
is that a question?
Well, it's a statement, but I believe I think it's a question just to confirm that for people.
Freight forwarders have to be registered not as manufacturers but as exporters. There's different kinds of registrations. There's if you register as a manufacturer of items, whether or not you export, it doesn't matter. Your registration number will usually be a 5-digit number. We'll have an M in front of it to show that you're a manufacturer. And there are different registrations, but freight forwarder, you can't just hang a shingle out and say, I'm going to be a freight forwarder now, because there are certain regulatory requirements to be a freight forwarder. You have to have certain criteria. So although you don't register as a manufacturer, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tom, but I've never seen any exemption for freight forwarders not to be registered in some way as an exporter.
Yeah, I know there's like 5 exemptions, I think, from registration, and
yeah,
I'll look at part 122. We can keep going, and we can come back to that question if there's anything to further clarify on it.
Okay. All right. Do we want to move to the next section, or are there more questions on this one?
That's all for now, so we can move on.
Okay. All right. Okay. The EAR, Export Administration Regulations, it's administered by the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS. And again, we said if it's for commercial or dual use, which means commercial and military, there's the answer to that question. It's controlled by the EAR and administrated by the BIS. Many items, in fact, everything in the world technically that isn't on the U.S. munitions list is subject to the EAR, but do not necessarily require a license for export. In fact, most things don't. As I mentioned, paper clips, paper clips would not be a controlled item, but they are under the control of the EAR, but the control basically is no license required. You can kind of ship it freely. So not everything is controlled in the interest of that you need a license. Please note that there are other agencies of the U.S. government that control exports. We mentioned OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Controls, as part of the Department of Treasury. They have their controls. The Department of Energy, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, obviously they control things that are involved with nuclear energy, et cetera. Department of Commerce has a patent and trademark office that may require some controls, if you have something patented or trademarked. there will be some kind of control. The Department of Commerce's Census Bureau, actually, that's who you report to through the automated export system. They're in control of that. And when you hear about trade balances and trade imbalances and things, it's the census part of the Department of Commerce that's keeping tabs on that. So certain exports have to be registered, not registered, have to be disclosed basically, and that goes through the Census Bureau. They want to know how many dollars and how many kilograms of certain products are flowing. And that's how to do that would be much more advanced than this training is. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security is now involved also in some kind of export controls. Okay, the Commerce Control List. I think this is the first time we're mentioning this in this training. The CCL. For all intents and purposes, if you're looking at the ITAR, the list of controlled defense articles is the U.S. munitions list. In the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, their version of that list is called the Commerce Control List, the CCL. It's got 5 major product groups. It's very expensive for classifying products. And whereas we talk about ITAR categories under the Commerce Control List, you've got export control classification numbers, ECCNs. So something is either going to have an ITAR category or it's going to have export control classification number. It's very complex. If you had a paper version of the ITAR sitting on your desk that was, normal, 8 by 10 size, whatever, the entire document may be an inch thick. If you had a paper copy, same size paper, same size print of the EAR, it might be 3 feet tall. I mean, it's huge because whereas the ITAR is only concerned with defense articles, the Commerce Control List is everything else, from paper clips to Boeing 777 aircraft. And the purpose of the ECCN is to clearly identify the component, material, technology, etc., so that proper licenses, restrictions, and exceptions may be applied. And there are exceptions in the EAR, and they're delineated in there for you. Sometimes it's complicated to get to them or to figure out which one applies. But whereas there are no exceptions to the U.S. munitions list or to the ITAR, there are exceptions in the commerce regulations. There are exemptions listed, defense articles, but not exceptions. And if you're going to export items under the EAR, you have to know the ECCN. That's like the critical first step. You need to know what it is you're trying to classify or ship. And here's an example of a couple of export ECCNs. 9A991 is for aircraft and gas turbine engines that are not controlled by other controls. You'll see a lot of that in the EAR. It'll say NES, not elsewhere specified. So, but 9A991 is your typical aircraft, civil type aircraft. 9A992 might be complete canopies, harnesses, and electronic release mechanisms, and these things go on forever. As far as the numbers, for instance, the 9 in the beginning, there are categories that start with 0, 1, 1 through 8, so they're all in there. Under the OFAC, the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Controls, when you hear about sanctions against countries, these are the people who monitor that and who administer it. And essentially, don't kid yourself. The U.S. uses its economic force to enact foreign policy goals. Earlier, we talked about how we can enforce our law, when it's outside the United States. Well, once again, if a country or a company proves to be uncooperative, OFAC can step in and exert economic force and make them a sanctioned company or a sanctioned country, and that's probably not good for anybody. They can block assets. They can lock up people's bank accounts. They can create trade restrictions, such as they have with Russia, and they can stop financial transactions. OFAC has a great deal of power. And, of course, its jurisdiction applies to all U.S. persons and citizens. Now, when we say that, the first question might come to mind and say, well, Vladimir Putin is not a U.S. person, so how can OFAC sanction him? Well, what they're doing is they're telling U.S. banks, U.S. companies, U.S. persons that they can't do business with him, and they'll freeze his assets in the United States. If they took it to the extreme, they could say, because of what's going on in Russia that the United States government doesn't like, we're going to go ahead and not allow transactions in rubles. If you think about how economically ruinous that could be to a country, that if U.S. banks decide they're not going to recognize that currency for a period of time. So believe me, even though their jurisdiction is over you and me, being U.S. persons, it can be far-reaching and global when it's enforced. Here are some sanctioned countries. This is a snapshot of a list, the OFAC list as of October 2013. It's when we printed it. Some of these countries should not surprise you. The asterisk at the bottom says you should always check the most recent list. Countries go in, countries go out. It's pretty hard to get off this list, actually, but we will put countries in, temporarily during certain periods of time. And as you can see, any of the former Yugoslavian countries in the Balkans, Belarus, country of Burma, Ivory Coast, Cuba. You always hear about, sanctions against Cuba. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iran, Iraq. I'm sure there's some ISIS measures in place now at this point. The part of Liberia that used to be under Charles Taylor's regime. North Korea, perpetually on the list since 1950. The Sudan, Syria, and Zimbabwe. If you look to the right, the reasons for this may be that these countries are involved in narcotics trafficking, non-proliferation concerns about nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons, so-called blood diamond trading for many, many years until I guess they reformed themselves. South Africa was on this list for that reason. And then state-sponsored terrorism states. That's why Iran and some of these other countries are on the list, Sudan especially. And essentially, these sanctions are designed to keep you away from these countries, companies, individuals, and/or practices. It's pretty cut and dry that way. You will not do business with these people. You will not visit them. You'll not have anything to do with them. And you really need to pay attention to these lists, especially if you have employees, if you have a salesperson who comes to your facility frequently, and all of a sudden the country that that person is from appears on this list. So you really have to be pretty diligent, and that's why we say screen people early, screen them often. And that's one reason why you really need a denied parties compliance policy. There's various mechanisms online, that, we're not going to endorse one or the other, whatever, but there are ways for you to go online and screen parties and people. Visual compliance is one that comes to mind, where you can type in a person's name, company, address, etc., and you can make the logic search broader or more narrowed. For instance, with a lot of foreign names of companies or people, there may be no correct English spelling for it because it's usually written in some other language like Mandarin or Arabic. Well, you can adjust the fuzzy logic search of it to look for every possible spelling, and you can really find out if somebody is on a denied parties list. You may get a false positive. In a lot of cases, people get that, where a person with a similar name is denied, but the person you're dealing with is not. And there are ways of dealing with that as well. You can annotate that you did your due diligence, that this particular John Doe is not the John Doe that's wanted by the FBI for something. So you can annotate it and go on that way. If your name accidentally appears on a list, there's ways of getting off it as well, and they can annotate it as such. We talked a little bit about freight forwarders. These are, quotes from people, my freight forwarder takes care of everything for me. Generally speaking, that may be true, but there are certain aspects. You have to have a power of attorney with that freight forwarder in order for them to file AES, automated export system. There are agreements, and plus you have to have an empowered official of your company who deals with the freight forwarder, signs things, provides them with the shipper's export declaration or the shipper's letter of instruction. Freight forwarders, essentially, they can't pull this stuff out of nowhere. So when you have a freight forwarder, indeed, they may take care of the actual export for you, but you have some upfront due diligence that you have to do to make sure that they have the right information in order to perform the transaction on your behalf. Key terms when you're talking about freight forwarders are U.S. and foreign principal party of interest, U.S. PPI or the FPPI. Generally, when you're the U.S. PPI, you have a very, very long, it's not a registration number, but it's an identification number. Your U.S. PPI number is a big, long number, and you would have to have the power of attorney to give that number to your freight forwarder so that they can file on your behalf. And then, of course, manufacturers and freight forwarders do share responsibilities under the law. So if someone's going to set them up to be a freight forwarder, they really need to know what they're doing, and you need to know what you're doing when dealing with them, because if a violation were to occur, the State Department is not going to assume that it was your freight forwarder's fault or that it's always your fault. They're going to look to see really where the problem was, who did what, and who's at fault. So basically, you share that responsibility with the freight forwarder. Okay, according to the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, hiring a freight forwarder does not relieve you of your responsibilities under the law, although the forwarders are responsible for the accuracy of the export information that they do file. They get that information from you. So it's a garbage in, garbage out system. Both freight forwarders and the companies that they work for must be aware, it should be, but must be aware of red flags and understand the general prohibitions. Red flags, again, in-depth discussions and other training. Essentially, if something doesn't look right, they say, see something, say something. If you're delivering to a company that's in Portugal, but the destination they want you to ship to is a warehouse in New Jersey, someplace, that might be a red flag. Something that just doesn't look right. If you get a bakery or somebody who's in a specific industry suddenly wants to buy a high technology X-ray machine, you might question that. That could be a red flag. Companies that are known to do business with countries like Iran, etc. Suddenly out of the clear blue sky they decide to become a customer of yours. That's a red flag. Somebody agrees that they're going to pay a large amount of cash. They don't haggle on the price. And you're overcharging them and they don't say anything about it, that might be a red flag as well. Because if people are going to try to smuggle or violate the law, sometimes money is no object to them. So these are, when we talk about red flags, it's things that you should be aware of in any transaction. Both freight forwarders and their customers can be subject to criminal prosecution and or administrative penalties if you violate the export administration regulations. Same goes with the ITAR, but this particular slide is addressing the BIS guidance. And both freight forwarders and their customers must be able to produce the AES records, automated export system records, for any given transaction. And that's one thing that we find that when we're consulting with companies, that even though they're filing AES, it was that on the previous slide where it said my freight forwarder takes care of everything. Yes, they have to keep records, but you have to keep records as well. So if you're using a freight forwarder and they're filing AES for you, you need to keep those AES records yourself. Because not keeping track of and being able to produce the AES records for audit purposes is in and of itself a finding or violation. And then if you go down, there's the link there you can go to, and it'll talk about freight forwarder guidance. Okay, we're at a question point again. Tom?
Thanks, Ray. One clarification, we get back into this lingo that so much of us speak, and we sometimes forget that people don't understand what we're talking about. But the question is, what is the difference between an exemption and an exception? Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I kind of brushed across that a little bit. Within the international, the ITAR, everybody knows what ITAR is now, so I don't have to spell it out every time. Okay, within the ITAR, there are exemptions to having a license. For instance, there's a whole list of Canadian exemptions. There are certain transactions with Canada that we've been doing for a very long time with Canada. The U.S. government has a cooperative agreement with Canada. Their Canada Controlled Goods Act is very much aligned with our ITAR. In fact, in some respects, it's even more restrictive. So there's a cooperation there. So you may have a Canadian exemption, whereas if you're shipping this article to a registered company in Canada, you won't need a license, whereas if you were shipping it to some other country, you would. So those are what we call exemptions. There are exemptions if you're shipping under a government bill of lading, where it turns out you're not going to be the actual exporter of record. You're shipping on behalf of, in the name of the United States government, so you may be using a government carrier. So those would be exemptions. Now, exceptions are in the EAR. Literally, you look under reasons for control after you found out the ECCN or the classification number of a product, and there'll be different reasons for control. It might be for anti-terrorism reasons, in fact, almost always in that case. It might be for missile technology reasons. There's a whole alphabet soup of what the exemptions are. Of what the controls are. Now, there are exceptions to those controls that may be based on certain countries, because once you come out with all that, you can see, okay, here's the reasons to control, here's my ECCN, and now I'm shipping to, let's say, Bulgaria. Then you go to a list of countries in
another section of the EAR, and you'll look up that country, and there'll be columns with all the different reasons for control, and you'll see if there's an X under it where that country intersects with a certain control. The X means you may need a license. There may be exceptions to that. For instance, once again, there's a gov exception where if you're shipping on behalf of the U.S. government, you wouldn't need a license. Personal baggage, BAG, is the exception where you don't, you would not have to have a license if you're carrying, let's say, your laptop or something else. You're carrying it overseas for your personal use. You're going to come back to the United States. Those would be like the exceptions. Tom, can you think of any other exceptions that might be a little more illustrative?
Did you mention LVS, the limited value shipment? That's another one.
Oh, yeah, right. Based on value, LVS is a very common exception that the Commerce Department, is not going to be concerned with things that are very low value shipments. With the ITAR, there is no de minimis. There is no, well, it only costs a dime, so therefore we're not going to control it. So again, the Commerce Department is going to base that on if it's a low value shipment, there would be an exception for that. That's a good point.
Thanks. A related question to that from the same person is, where do we find ITAR exemptions? And I think the answer to that is there is no one place in the ITAR, right, Ray? I mean, they're located in a few different areas.
There are a couple of places, and when we're done with the actual slides here, I can actually I'll actually call up the table of contents for the current ITAR, and we can kind of, I can point out various places where you'll find, because there's exemptions of general applicability. There's a whole section on Canadian exemptions, et cetera. We now have some treaty exemptions with the UK and Australia, and there's certain programs, on behalf of Her Majesty's government or the United States government that you have exemptions from licensing requirements. But it's not found in one place. But if somebody wants to hang around at the end of this, I can throw the table of contents up for like a couple of minutes, and you can see it.
Great. We have some more questions coming in, but let's continue, Ray, and we'll get through the material then, and then we'll wrap up with questions. And if you want to show some folks where those exemptions are on the ITAR, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Okay. What are the next steps in the export compliance process? Obviously, learning more. We did not say up front that this was going to make you an expert in export compliance. We're just raising your awareness. So obviously, if some of the things piqued your interest or remind you of your company and what you're doing, or that you're not doing something, you want to learn more. You want to know how your business is affected by these regulations, what your vulnerability is to possible violations. If you need to be registered with the DDTC, that's a really good next step. It might even be the first step, but learning more probably does come ahead, a little bit ahead of that. You want to evaluate your past and current exports to see if there may have been some violations you might have to disclose. If applicable, you may have to do voluntary disclosure. You want to develop and implement a compliance program. In the case of a disclosure or a violation or a potential violation, there's a couple of things the government is going to look for or ask about first. And they're going to say, send us a copy of your export compliance program. And if it's a one-page document, that's not sufficient, that's probably going to be problematic for you. So essentially, having a compliance program in and of itself can be a mitigating factor, especially if a violation happened, let's say, before you had the compliance program in place. So once again, having a compliance program is a big thing that the government's going to look for. Once again, they say if you're doing $4 billion worth of business and you're only spending $100,000 a year on compliance, they're going to see that as you're possibly turning a blind eye towards the regulations. Training employees is important. At the very least, most compliance programs involve annual training of employees who may be involved in export compliance or export activities or import activities. Training new employees, at least just giving them an overall awareness. When you have your new employee training and you're telling them, this is your badge, this is your parking lot, et cetera, all these kind of things, a lot of companies will have an initial employee orientation, just a very, very broad brush, not even as in-depth as today's training, just to get your employees aware that you are dealing with export items and need to be diligent. And then, you know, the marketing system, you want to make sure that internally everybody knows that you have the compliance program. A big thing that we always stress is from the top down, the president of your company or whoever the top person is, you know, puts out a memo and tells people, hey folks, you know, we're going to take this export stuff seriously. I take it seriously, and we want you to cooperate on behalf of the company, because it really is all about reducing vulnerability to the company itself. Obviously, the employees benefit because they know that they're doing the right thing, and it really is. It's a win-win for everybody. No matter how much profit you make on a contract or a transaction, one violation can wipe out your bottom line. So you want to make sure that you enthusiastically market the system that you have internally, keep it up to date. When changes to the regulations occur, you may have to either modify the procedure itself or just make your employees aware that, hey, something has changed. And this is our contact information. Tom put his number down. You know, that's that would be your first step in contacting us, obviously. And there's his email address. And I think the next thing here, and I can go back to the slide if somebody hasn't copied it down, but once again, we're going to put these as a PDF up for your edification. And I thank you for attending. Yeah. And Tom, you said there may be some more questions, whatever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that page while you're talking here. The page of the.
Sure. I just realized I should have put your email and phone number down, not mine.
Oh well. You know, I noticed that, but I just chose not to say anything.
I'm just teasing. We'd be happy to field any questions from you all offline, and you know, if there's something that we weren't able to cover in the session today, or if you'd like to talk with us further, certainly reach out to me, or you know, if I can put you in touch with Ray, and we can just help you get the answer that you need. A couple questions here, Ray, just as you're looking up for the exemptions. So one of them is my company, or let's see, my suppliers are telling me that they need to be ITAR certified, and they have that word in quotes, certified. Is there a certification program for the ITAR? Yeah.
No, we like to stay away from words like certification because the implication from that, or the misconception, if you will, would be that if you're somehow certified by the government, you can do things that other companies can't, such as, you know, not have a license. There was a movement back in I guess it was the 90s, where big companies, you know, like Textron and Lockheed and everything was saying, well, you know, we're so good at this that why don't you let us do our own licenses? In other words, we'll self-approve our licenses, we'll keep track of it, they'll be auditable, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as this argument starts going on, what happens is a Lockheed or Boeing or General Dynamics suddenly gets caught doing something untoward. So there is no certification per se. Everybody registered, yes, but certified, no. You still have to apply for licenses and have them approved by the government. There's no amount of certification that's going to make that go away.
Good point. And we have a lot of questions on exemptions. So as you're looking for these exemptions here, Ray, we can see your screen now. But the question is, how do we assume a shipment is exempted from ITAR? Is it just ship as usual, or do we need to do something else? We understand we don't need to apply for a license. So I guess the question is, how do they claim the exemption, or how do they move forward with that?
Okay, well, yeah, and we'll use an exemption or two as examples of this. Before I get to that, though, we talk about Part 121, the U.S. munitions list. That's how you find everything. I recommend that you have some kind of electronic version. In this case, I'm using a annotated version of it that's put out by another company, but it's very good. And you can copy and paste. Let's say if you have to talk to your marketing department about what they can and cannot do for a given thing. You can actually copy and paste out of this, whereas if you're using a paper copy of the ITAR, number one, it might be out of date when you're using it, and number two is you'd have to retype a bunch of stuff if you wanted to quote from it. So I like to use a Word version of it that I can copy and paste and quote chapter and verse from. And this section here is about licenses, temporary and permanent. There's a certain licenses. You may find some exemptions, Canadian and Mexican border shipments here. Let me go down to where past licenses. Let's see, where are we? Did I pass it already? I think I did.
You went past the
Yeah.
Canadian 120.
Yeah. Where is it? I think my finger just moved too quick. Okay, general policies and provisions. You can see here 126.5 of the Canadian exemptions. Canada, and then down here 126.15. Processing of license applications for the export of defense articles and defense services to Australia or the United Kingdom. So that was recently added within the last year or two to the ITAR. And then, of course, exemption pursuant to the Defense Trade Cooperation Treaty between the U.S. and Australia, and 126.17, exemption pursuant to the Defense Trade Cooperation Treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, we can actually use one of these. Let's go to Canada first. And of course, we have the electronic version. Also, you can jump from the table of contents right to the page in question. Okay, almost everything that has an exemption in it. In fact, if you just want to look for obscure exemptions, if you look for the phrase "Port Directors of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and Postmasters shall permit," that's the phrase that everything starts with. Those are the people who say yay or nay whether something be exported. So all the exemptions will have that phrase in there some way, shape, or form. And it says that, in this case, Port Directors of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and Postmasters shall permit the temporary import and return to Canada without a license of any unclassified defense articles, and they're described as the definition at 120.6, that originate in Canada for temporary use in the United States and return to Canada. All other temporary imports shall be in accordance with, and then there's other things that would not be exempted. Here's another one, the B, sub B, except as provided in Supplement 1. Once again, there's, you have to do a lot of cross references in these things, but basically the CBP and postmasters shall permit, when for end use in Canada by Canadian, federal, or provincial government authorities acting in the official capacity or by a Canadian registered person, all this, or for return to the U.S., the temporary permanent and temporary export to Canada without a license of unclassified defense articles. And in this case, by unclassified, they do mean secret, top secret, that it's not any of those things. The exceptions are subject to meeting the requirements of this subchapter. So you really have to, and if you're looking to use a Canadian exemption, you wouldn't stop at paragraph A or paragraph B and go, aha, there's my exemption. You want to read the entire site. In this case, paragraph B continues down here. You want to make sure that the person or the company you're sending to is a Canadian registered person, and that's any Canadian national, including business entities, dual citizens of Canada, third country, other than a country that's prohibited, like Iraq or Cuba, etc., and permanent resident registered in Canada in accordance with the Canadian Defense Production Act. So this is a specific list. The way we register with the DDTC, Canadian Crown Corporations is what they're called. They're registered as well, and they should be able to produce proof that they are a Canadian Crown Corporation, and then you can start using Canadian exemptions with them. If it's a mom-and-pop operation or a company that just started doing business in Canada, you might not be able to use the Canadian exemption because they would not be registered. And then this goes through all the different things. Now, all the different parts of the Canadian exemption.
Thanks, Ray.
Now, if you want to, okay.
Just a quick note on that. So I think I've talked to people before who they hear Canadian exemption and they think, well, now I can send all of my ITAR work to Canada because there's a Canadian exemption. And what Ray's highlighting is that it's more detailed than that. You need to read through it. There are carve-outs. There are certain things that don't apply. And it takes a little bit of effort to understand whether the exemption applies for you or not. So it's not a quick and easy answer, I would say. But when you compare that with the time and effort that's going to go into applying for an export license, then it may be worthwhile to evaluate the exemptions. And certainly that's what they're there for, is to save companies time and to allow for the movement of goods without the need for a license. So,
right. I'm not going to go into this one in detail, but I have up on the screen among the newest exemptions, due to the treaty between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And it explains essentially what you can use it for and what you cannot. For instance, there are certain programs, cooperative programs. One of them is called Mastiff. It's an armored fighting vehicle that the British use. That entire program, if you're on behalf of that, you can use this exemption because it's a vehicle that's been recognized as a program, and the United States is cooperating with Her Majesty's government, and so you would be able to use parts of this exemption for sending supplies that are going to go onto that specific program. But you see it's kind of long, so if you're really going to make use of exemptions, you want to read through the entire section that may apply to your exemption to make sure, because there are always things saying you can do this unless this or this exists. Down here, when it talks about the United Kingdom community, and it defines what it is, Her Majesty's government. I guess if they get a king there, they'll have to change this to his at some point. But anyway, there is an approved community that you can find on the DDTC website to see if the company or entity that you're dealing with is legitimately, if you're legitimately able to use this exemption for them. So, and here are some of the authorized end uses: counterterrorism, research and development, mutually determined specific security. So again, we cooperate with the UK, and Australia has its own versions, and also Canada, and you want to make sure your exemptions fully apply.
Thanks, Ray. Well, here's our last question. It's a non-exemption question, but it will be the last one of the session because we're up against our time here. Is there information available somewhere on how to develop and implement a compliance program for ITAR and EAR?
Well, you can go to our website. Once again, I can't stress that enough. But on the slide there, and the slide I guess you'll have copies of, it'll take you to our website, and you can see the kind of things that we can offer. Could you go out and look this stuff up yourself and come up with a compliant program? You possibly could, but I guess that would go to the question of, do we need to hire an expert? That would probably, you'd be getting into that territory. You'd have to hire somebody who has quite a bit of experience with this. You can go to the Department of Commerce site, and they have suggestions. There are, for instance, guidelines that are put out by both the State Department and by the Commerce Department, how to write a license application, how to do an agreement, etc., how to classify items. You can basically peruse those sites and look for it, and they will have guidelines for you, but they're not easy. Sometimes they're not always easy to interpret. But Tom, can you think of any other sources?
Yeah, well, I think Commerce. I think both BIS and DDTC provide a lot of good resources. I would say that BIS probably has more resources available online for that type of thing. Yeah. So those are both good places to go. The other organization that I'll mention and plug here is called the International Compliance Professionals Association, or the ICPA. Right. That's a paid membership that your company can join. But when you do that, and we've been ICPA members for a number of years, you get access to their online Q&A repository, and that's a good resource, because what you'll find there are questions being posed by trade compliance professionals, including questions about, like, how do you develop a compliance program for XYZ type of industry, or what kind of policies do you see for for my industry or for this kind of situation. And then you'll get answers back from a lot of the membership providing insight and guidance on that. So I would say that ICPA is another good place to start if you're just getting into this, or you're developing and trying to look at how to develop and implement policies and procedures. You might find some good information there.
Yep.
Okay. Great. So thanks, Ray. This was very helpful, very good information. I appreciate all the time that you took to present this to us and go over all this. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We are going to wrap it up now. Again, if we didn't answer a question, or we didn't have time, or weren't able to address anything specifically for you, please feel free to follow up with us. Look for a copy of these slides posted on our website, usually within a week. So by next Wednesday, you should be able to download a copy of the slide presentation as well as a recording of this presentation. And we hope to see you at a future session of one of our other free webinars in the near future. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Tom.